Okay, so we come to the third and last talk of our session, and I'm happy to have Malte Storm here, who will talk us about handling different analysis workflows in a modular framework. So the stage is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. So yes, as Karina already said, my title is Handling Different Analysis Workflows in a Modular Framework. I'll start with a quick introduction before going a bit more into the architectural layout of our solution. Why? We are part of Helmholtz Zentrum Gestacht. We operate an outstation on the deRSE campus. We have a few experiments at the Petworth 3 storage ring, a few tomography, a few diffraction experiments. In this talk, I'll just talk about the diffraction. But we have one experiment for in situ nanodiffraction, another one for high energy, and another one for wide beam diffraction. So these are still the same technique, but in quite different instances of how the experiments are run. So these are some examples of the samples we have. So it can literally be just a few microns of, in this case, a titanium nitride coating on the steel. We have soft matter like wood samples, also a few microns. On the other extreme end of the range is really huge in situ environments, which can weigh several hundred kilograms. And usually with metals, we also have had full motor blocks on there, and literally anything in between, polymers, you name it, we've probably seen it. The motivation for new software is we have a political mandate, as most Helmholtz centers do, to make the experiments more accessible. The key word is offer analysis, not experiments. So for now, we don't want to limit the experiments to domain scientists who also have a background in X-ray diffraction, but really to all domain scientists. So one of the hurdles is the analysis. So the experiments are well covered, but the analysis, this is an old pipeline example. You have to switch back and forth between a lot of tools. A lot of it is also command line specific, which, well, you probably don't care with a software background, but for a lot of users, thinking also biologists, that can be a hurdle. So we developed a new tool called deRSE, which integrates all these steps into a single tool with a user interface. So deRSE is an acronym for Python Diffraction Data Analysis Suite. The key requirements when we developed this were it should be easy to use, and it should have a graphical user interface. A second requirement for us is it should enable fast analysis during experiments. So our experiments are expensive in the sense that time is very limited. So if you think of in situ processes, you really need to know more or less live when to stop with your process and when to switch over to the next experiment. The tool should also be widely deployable and scalable. So yeah, you should be able to run it on a laptop if you're sitting on the train, but it should also be able to run on the cluster. So it is a Python package with a graphical user interface, but it also offers low-level access to all functionalities to allow scripting. It uses Qt as a framework for the user interface, persistent configuration storage, and configuration. The requirements for our workflows are quite diverse. So we have a lot of different analysis goals, materials, different experimental conditions, which might require different processing strategies. So the generic functionality we can offer is usually sufficient for routine experiments, but if you're thinking of, especially if you go with in situ process, etc., you might require some additional expert functionality, which we can cover by default, but which is required to be there. So we opted for a workflow based on trees and plugins. The plugins themselves are quite simple in the structure because we want to be able to offer users the chance to put their own plugins into our workflows. So there's really just a few minimum requirements. They must inherit from the base class for automatic discovery. I'll come to that later. There's some basic class attributes, which is essentially metadata. And then some two methods: a pre-execute, which is run once at the beginning of the workflow, and then an execute for each data point. You can add some additional stuff like custom configuration widgets or storage of intermediate results, but these are not required. So this is really a real-world example of a plugin. So you see it's quite simple. So if you have Python code that does your analysis, it's really easy to put it into the pipeline. Plugins are made accessible through a registry. So you can give it paths, which are stored persistently with the queue settings. And the registry just scans all files in the paths, and if it discovers any subclasses from the base plugin, it registers them, and then they're accessible, and the registry also offers to find things based on names, classes, access to stored paths. In the graphical user interface, you have a widget for browsing the plugins, so you can display all available plugins. You can search the search field. You also get the metadata information. So if you don't know what you want to do, you can just go through them and have direct access to the descriptions of what the plugin does. So how does the workflow then work? There's basically two classes involved. There's a processing tree, which is a controller class, handles import and export, registry, and managing of the nodes, and starts the processing. And the workflow nodes, they are really just responsible for handling the data transport and for the plugin execution. So yeah, if a user inputs data, it goes to the processing tree, and then through all the nodes, makes the loop through the plugins before it's handled further down. Why like this? Because the node is then part of the framework, whereas the plugins can be plugged in externally, and you can add them without having to modify the base code base. If you want to run full workflows, so that was just an example for a single file. That's all good and well, but we usually have batches of up to tens of thousands. So you want to run them by batch processing. There's two contexts which handle the experimental metadata, so they can be set up independently of the processes. There's an executive workflow app which does all the processing, passing on of information which is stored in a different file, and the reason why we have this one talking to the processing tree and as a middle layer is parallelization. So to parallelize things, you want to spin up worker processes. And then these worker processes can just run the executive workflow app with copies of all the contexts in this case. And the advantage is that we have the controller process for the processes as a separate thread. So remember, this is all designed with the graphical user interface in mind. So we really need something which doesn't block the user interface while processing is going on. So that's why there's a separate thread here. And communication is done with the processes, just queues. But I added here that there's a shared memory buffer. So one of the issues with pushing data through the queues, whether it's the original multiprocessing or MPI, is that the data is serialized, so you don't want to use the queues to really transport large amounts of data. So there's a shared memory buffer, and the process really just communicate pointers to the data, which allows then this instance of the app to store results from the shared memory buffer. Metadata is one crucial point, of course. So we handle metadata internally. So everything that's going on uses a subclass, ND array, with metadata attached to it, so you can't lose it. And for export of data, we use HDF5, which is a container format. For now, that's the only one supported. And we really have put all the metadata in there with the results. So all the access labels for the data, but also all the processing metadata, including all the contexts, are stored in a file. So every result file you get really has the complete context you need to rerun the exact same workflow, of course, subject to having the raw data available. A bit more general about FAIR. Well, PyDeRSE is open source. We use the GPL3 license. It's designed really with reusability in mind. So components are separated, so you can really just pick single things out. The processing logic is separated from the user interface, and the user interface itself is dynamic as well. It's generated dynamically, composed of frames, and then the startup script, you can just really register which frames to use in the main interface class, and then it spins up with just those that you want enabled. There's one thing to improve. For now, the generic components are not separated from the XLD specific components yet. If you want to reuse it, you still have the dependencies of the XLD specific components in there. So, well, that's just a matter of time. So if we have time, we'd like to separate that, but you know how things are. So to conclude, PyDeRSE was developed with X-ray diffraction data analysis in mind, but it's versatile enough to be used for other things as well. So for example, one of the experiments is just redesigning the experiment control interface based on this framework. It's in production, it's used by users, and the feedback is positive. We are committed to maintaining it, so hopefully it'll be maintained throughout the full life cycle. And the goal really is here also to build a larger community so that if the user base has their specific things and develops a plugin for the analysis, that they can be shared so that the functionality grows over time. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.